Hi, good evening, everybody.
Hey.
Good evening.
Or good morning in Brisbane.
I assume we can get started soon. I'm thinking everybody in the rest of the call can see me. Yep. We'll just wait a couple more seconds just for a few more people to come in. Okay, I think we can get started. All right, so hi everybody. Welcome to this Antarcon session on rethinking Antarctic environments and conservation. I'm Natasha Gardiner and I will be your chair for this session on behalf of our wider convener team, which includes myself, Hyoung, Chul, Shin and Gilbert from Antarcon Synthesis Theme, Daniela Liggett, Steve Chignell and Adrian Howkins from Research Theme 3, and also Jilda Caccavo from Antarcon's leadership team. We're all really looking forward to this session and we hope that what we'll talk about today can stimulate further discussions and possibly also research collaborations that share a collective vision to improve on current Antarctic conservation efforts, to enrich the relationship between Antarctic research and governance, and also to expand upon our current framings of Antarctic human-environment interactions. So I have a fantastic list of esteemed speakers before me, and we warmly welcome you all. We'd also like to welcome and thank Zhufeng Li, who has a poster for the session entitled The Status, Problems and Proposals of the Antarctic Specially Protected Area System. So please do take the time to look at this poster via the e-poster exhibition space on the events platform. We've given each speaker 10 minutes, and if there's time, just a minute or so for one question directly following each talk. If you do want to ask a question, we ask that you type it into the chat box. And if we run out of time to directly address your questions on the floor, the speakers can respond to you via the chat. So for this reason, please indicate who your question is for. Unfortunately, we have very little time for questions at the end, so make sure you are asking them throughout the session. As for the speakers, I will interrupt you at 10 minutes. So at that point, we ask that you wrap up to ensure that we have enough time for the rest of the speakers in the session. And just so that everybody is aware, the session will be recorded and made available to registered participants in the past events section of the events platform. And the organisers are also aiming to upload the recordings to the SCAR YouTube channel. So for any of the speakers, if you don't want your presentation made available on YouTube, you can reach out to the email address scar2020@albonmeetings.com by the 12th of August to opt out. So without further ado, I now have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Jilda Caccavo, who will be speaking to us today about the marine ecosystem assessment for the Southern Ocean, including outcomes, updates, and next steps. So please put your virtual hands together for Jilda.
Thanks, Natasha. Okay, wait, get rid of that. Can you see my screen?
No.
Okay, hold on. I can't see any of you. I didn't start my share. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Now,
yeah, we can see it now.
I'll show you. Perfect. Okay, and I'll move you guys to my main screen. Okay, perfect. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Jilda Caccavo, and I'm going to be presenting to you today the outcomes and future plans for the Marine Ecosystem Assessment for the Southern Ocean, or MISO. And I'm doing this on behalf of a huge team of over 200 scientists from 19 countries. So really, I'm just a drop in the water there of this whole assessment. And in particular, this presentation has been built on many presentations of MISO's outcomes that were contributed to by the authors listed here: Sean Henley, Nadine Johnston, Susie Grant, Andrew Constable, Jess Melbourne Thomas, and Juan Hoffer. And so what I'm going to be going through with you guys today is discussing the underpinnings of MISO, followed by a series of key messages derived from the MISO outcomes, after which I'll be discussing the various forms that the MISO outputs have and continue to take, before closing with a brief mention of our future work. So I'll start by outlining the MISO process. So this map outlines the different MISO sectors into which we divided the Southern Ocean in order to take on regionally specific assessments. And so MISO was born of a conference in Hobart in 2018. The conference highlighted research on observing system design, ecosystem assessments, habitat species and food web modeling, as well as biotic responses to ecosystem change. And all of this was in a framework that included policymakers. In fact, the conference itself actually ended with a policy forum during which policymakers could describe the type of research they needed to address policy needs. And one of the goals of this conference was indeed to support early career researchers in this endeavor. And I'm actually here in the front. This was my first time in Hobart specifically, and in Australia, Oceania generally. And I was able to participate at this launch conference because of generous travel support provided by the MISO initiative. And so after the MISO kickoff conference, SOCI, or the Southern Ocean Wiki, was developed. And the goal of this wiki was to generate an up-to-date assessment of ecosystem information, scientific methods, and modeling. And these wiki pages resulted in assessment pages that underwent expert and peer review, so that we had this reference material on which the assessment papers themselves could be built. So the MISO special issue and infographic summary book was the final product that the assessment, the form that it took, and I'm going to be talking a bit more about that in later slides. And this was, in short, an effort that lasted over several years, involving over 200 authors. And now we find ourselves in the lessons learned phase, working on final synthesis products and considering what future directions MISO is going to take. And part of this final phase is reconnecting with the network supporting our activities, because indeed, MISO is a core activity of ICE, which is itself the Southern Ocean Regional Program for the network IMBER. And so the vision of MISO is to undertake periodic and systematic assessments of the status and change of Southern Ocean ecosystems in order to inform decision-making at global and local scales. So in order to achieve this vision, our philosophy is to engage in a community-driven process that involves diverse stakeholders, early career researchers across a range of disciplines in order to define pathways to transform assessment outputs into policy. And so diversity was a top priority in the MISO process. We sought to achieve gender equity and geographic balance across leadership roles, both on the steering committee and among lead authors of assessment papers. 70% of assessment papers were led by female authors, and 50% of lead authors were actually early career researchers, as you can see from the two charts here, which outline the number of early career researchers at different periods post-PhD, along with their country of origin. The full list of assessment paper authors actually included, as I've mentioned multiple times, over 200 scientists from 19 different countries. But in addition to just these metrics of gender, geographic, and career stage diversity, we also sought to include a diversity of topics relevant to the assessment. So now I'll be switching gears a bit from the MISO process to the MISO outcomes, which include a series of key messages that represent a synthesis of the overall MISO assessment. So we're all familiar with the central role that the Southern Ocean plays in Earth's ocean's climate system, as you can appreciate from the projection shown here. So the Southern Ocean is at the center of the global ocean circulation system. It transports heat, nutrients, and CO2 throughout the world's oceans. Indeed, this exchange of CO2 between the air and the seawater is of critical importance to the global climate system. But beyond this biogeochemistry, The Southern Ocean is home to highly productive ecosystems, which include large numbers of linkages and interactions with the global oceans, as we can appreciate, for example, with respect to whale migrations, for example. And the extent and complexity of this global connectivity is a key outcome of the MISO initiative. The important take-home message here being that changes occurring in the Southern Ocean affect the entire global system and its human population. So Southern Ocean ecosystems support biodiversity, nutrient supply, climate regulation, food security, just to name a few. And as can be appreciated in this infographic here, the life cycles of many Southern Ocean species are closely linked to seasonal changes in sea ice and thus are sensitive to climate change. A message reiterated again and again in MISO outputs is that the changes in ecosystem structure and functioning in the Southern Ocean are already underway. So one of the main goals of MISO was to identify the most relevant and cross-cutting stressors and drivers of change in the Southern Ocean, which are summarized in the infographic here. Many of these large-scale drivers of change are indeed associated with global climate change, while local drivers of change can more often be derived from human activity within the Southern Ocean itself. Another key message from MISO is the complexity of ecosystem responses to this interplay between multiple stressors due to synergies between drivers and their impacts on ultimate tipping points. So as established earlier, Southern Ocean ecosystem intricately connected to the global oceans and climate system. So changes in Southern Ocean ecosystems have global consequences. Major shifts in these ecosystems can result in loss of key ecosystem components and functions, which can have regional and global consequences on biodiversity. And these ecosystem services are increasingly at risk with the increasing impacts of climate change and other human stressors. And furthermore, these risks will only be further compounded by an increased demand for Southern Ocean ecosystem services as human activities intensify. So the ultimate conclusion of these key messages is that action is required to safeguard Southern Ocean ecosystems. It's true that global drivers such as climate change are beyond the scope of regional management in the Southern Ocean, but that means that, of course, global efforts are required to continue to mitigate and minimize further changes to the Southern Ocean ecosystems, and policy decisions generally have to foster resilience to climate and environmental change by preserving ecosystems, providing refuge, and aiding in recovery through, for example, the development of marine protected areas. Ongoing research and monitoring is critical on the local and regional scales in order to affect this ecosystem conservation and management that's precautionary and responsive to these continued changes. So all of these key messages that I just summarized, these come from the assessment itself, which took the form, as I mentioned, of a special issue in Frontiers, which included 20 articles from 176 authors published between June of 2020 and December of 2021. So this word cloud is based on all of the papers from the assessment, and you can imagine this spanned a range of topics, including the context of MISO, Southern Ocean biogeochemistry, biota from plankton to birds and mammals, food web analyses, as well as challenges, lessons, and future directions for Southern Ocean ecosystem research. In the IPCC report that recently has been developed from Working Group 2, 4 MISO papers were cited in Chapter 3 of the report on oceans, 12 MISO papers were cited in the 6th cross-chapter paper on polar regions, and all of the MISO papers provided a foundation for the prognoses of change that were outlined in the summary for policymakers. MISO showed up at COP26 last November. I was lucky enough to be able to go with Susie Grant, Nadine Johnston, and Sean Henley to present MISO outcomes in the Cryosphere Pavilion. This was a 1.5-hour session that was live streamed. It had over 300 views, and there were over 40 people in person at the pavilion. And MISO showed up again recently at the UN Oceans Conference, where they participated in a session on both poles looking at cross-cutting issues. And this was also a live stream session that lasted over 2 hours. So I'd like to just quickly close with future directions. So MISO has been working, this is a screenshot from one of our recent meetings, on developing a high impact synthesis work of the assessment itself. This will include important messages for policymakers, new and novel outcomes from MISO, based on the best available science, and citing urgent priorities in line with the UN Ocean Decade. So how can you get involved? Keep an eye out for future iterations of MISO, which is going to be developing in the coming years. And the best way to do that is to be involved, signed up for ICED, the Integrating Climate and Ecosystem Dynamics in the Southern Ocean regional program of IMBER, as well as the Southern Ocean UN Decade. You can have this presentation if you want, just let me know. I'm happy to share it with you, and embedded here are all the links to the special issue, the outputs I talked about, as well as the relevant networks. So thank you so much for your time. I can't wait to hear the rest of the talks in the session, and happy to take a question if there's time.
Thank you so much, Jilda. That is an absolutely mammoth amount of work to summarize in 10 minutes, so well done. I can't see any questions in the question and answer box just yet. So unless someone's going to ask one immediately, I might take the chance to move on so we can accumulate some question time. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Joanna Burrows. She'll be speaking to us about evaluating the conservation impact of Antarctica's protected areas.
Thanks, Natasha. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah,
great.
Sure can.
Perfect. All right, hi everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation about evaluating the conservation impact of Antarctica's protected areas. My name's Jo Burrows and I'm a PhD candidate at the Queensland University of Technology. And my co-authors on this work are Dr. Jasmine Lee and Professor Kerry Wilson. I acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people as the traditional owners of the unceded land on which QUT now stands. This research is supported by the ARC Special Research Initiative, Securing Antarctica's Environmental Future. And this manuscript is currently in preparation and will be submitted for publication shortly. So I just ask you to please hold off on sharing any content from it for now. So as we know, some Antarctic environments are at risk of threats posed by local activities, such as introduced species, pollution, and habitat alteration. Antarctic Specially Protected Areas, or ASPAs, serve to protect outstanding values from harm. And there are currently 75 ASPAs across Antarctica, with the majority of these designated to primarily to protect important species, ecosystems, or landscape attributes. But the current ASPA network is unrepresentative of the continent's biodiversity and ecosystems due to its inadequate size and configuration. And consequently, several authors have called for the systematic revision and expansion of the ASPA network, and the CEP has endorsed this. But while the quantity and placement of protected areas have been scrutinised, little attention has been given to the quality of that protection in terms of measurable on-ground conservation outcomes. Previous evaluations of ASPA effectiveness have focused on their sampling and design characteristics, and these assessments justify the systematic expansion of the ASPA network. However, while this could increase the representation of outstanding values within ASPAs, representation doesn't guarantee genuine protection in terms of the avoided loss or improvement of those values. So an important question remains unanswered, and that is, do ASPAs actually work? To answer this question, we need to evaluate the performance of ASPAs in terms of the quality of protection that they offer. And there are several approaches to assessing protected area effectiveness. Impact evaluation is one approach, which quantifies the effect of an intervention compared to no intervention. In this context, impact refers to the difference between the outcomes of interest in a protected area and what would have occurred in that same area if it weren't protected. This is called the counterfactual, and because we can't know the true counterfactual scenario, we must construct one. Employing a counterfactual approach allows observed outcomes to be attributed to the area's protection and eliminate alternative explanations for an observed outcome. To attribute effects to causes in impact evaluation requires experiments or quasi-experiments. And true experiments are generally not feasible for protected area impact evaluations, so quasi-experimental methods are preferred. A common method is statistical matching, which compares indicators in protected areas with those of unprotected areas that share similar characteristics. In the past decade, many impact evaluations of protected areas have been conducted, but not in Antarctica. So what challenges do we need to overcome to evaluate the conservation impact of ASPers? Well, firstly, we need to know how ASPers are meant to work before we can evaluate if they work. Secondly, data collection and monitoring efforts must be suited to impact evaluation studies. And third, the scale of analysis of ASPer impact evaluation must be relevant to management and decision making. So let's take a quick look at each of these in more detail. The conservation impact of an ASPer is influenced by potentially numerous factors. A confounder is a variable that influences both the likelihood of any area being protected as an ASPer in the first place and an outcome of interest, or a mediator that drives that outcome. So a potential example of a confounder for ASPers could be distance to a research station, because we know that ASPers are more likely to be located near research stations. And it's also reasonable to expect that environments might be more heavily impacted near research stations. Confounding factors can mask the true effect of area protection. So ASPer impact evaluation studies must compare treatment and control units that match in terms of any confounding factors. Moderators are variables that influence the magnitude or direction of a treatment effect and could be ecological or institutional. To design robust ASPer impact evaluation studies, the causal pathways through which ASPer designation generates conservation outcomes and all of the covariates that influence these must be identified. So can we use existing data sets to evaluate the conservation impact of ASPers? Well, one way of evaluating effectiveness could be to compare human impacts inside and outside of ASPers. But the potential for environmental harm to arise from breaches of protocol, such as unauthorized visitation to ASPers or visitation that doesn't fully comply with a permit, means that we can't rely on official data sets alone to quantify the full extent or intensity of human impacts on Antarctic environments. And these impacts aren't necessarily routinely assessed as part of ASPer management either. For those ASPers in which the condition of protected values is routinely monitored, this data might only be conducive to impact evaluation if meaningful comparisons can be drawn to a carefully established counterfactual. So additional data would likely be required to do this. What about the scale of impact evaluation? Well, although ASPers are all established under the same regulatory framework and via the same institutional process, ASPers differ in terms of the values they protect, their age, their management authorities, their permitting criteria, and their management actions. Impact evaluation of multiple ASPers individually will build a solid evidence base for the network's collective impact and potentially reveal differences in ASPer performance across space and time, allowing us to identify factors that influence effectiveness. Such analyses may also inform decision-making about current and future ASPer management strategies. So in this regard, impact evaluation is likely to be the most relevant when conducted at the scale of the individual ASPer, such that the effectiveness of the ASPer network is the sum of that of its parts. So while impact evaluation studies in Antarctica will create new information requirements, they will ultimately improve the efficiency of ASPers by allowing us to identify what does and doesn't work to preserve Antarctic biodiversity and environments. And so our overarching recommendation is to begin conducting impact evaluation studies to determine the causal effects of ASPers on their environments. And the following actions will enable progress towards that goal. Firstly, to determine the conservation impact of ASPers, the specific outcomes ASPers are intended to generate and how must be articulated. This requires a theory of change, which is vital for informing the development of robust impact evaluation study designs. A theory of change can also serve as a guide for policy review and improvement by highlighting the variables that can be manipulated and assumptions that must be satisfied to ensure that ASPers can achieve their intended outcomes. Secondly, conservation interventions should be designed and implemented in a way that allows for evaluation of their impact in the future. We could do this by developing evaluation plans, specifying suitable control sites for comparison, and collecting baseline environmental and institutional data, all at the time of ASPer designation. We could also identify the most relevant indicators and methods for impact evaluation within ASPer management plans. The proposed expansion of the ASPer network presents a timely opportunity to implement these changes because these processes can be facilitated during the systematic conservation planning process. Third, we should employ complementary and interdisciplinary approaches to assess the effectiveness of ASPERs. In particular, there is an opportunity for evaluation frameworks to incorporate social dimensions. The social dimensions of protected areas can include the functions and services they provide to people, and in other parts of the world, relevant indicators of social performance include economic well-being, health, political empowerment, and education. But the extent to which these types of indicators are relevant in the Antarctic context is unclear. So there is an opportunity to identify alternative indicators here. And finally, as knowledge about ASPER performance comes to light, in addition to informing the management of individual ASPERs, we can examine spatial, temporal, and institutional differences in ASPER outcomes and explore the extent to which contributors to success are transferable or scalable across the continent. So to conclude, evaluating the performance of ASPERs aligns with the best available science standard that guides Antarctic environmental management and can help us optimize conservation outcomes across the continent. Importantly, though, our current lack of knowledge about the conservation impact of ASPERs shouldn't be considered a barrier to expanding the ASPER network, but rather a timely opportunity to improve its efficiency in the design phase by illuminating, understanding, and exploiting drivers of effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. That was fantastic, and I really look forward to reading your paper. I have seen something pop up in the chat here from Dana Bergstrom. Comment for Jo, great talk, thank you. ASPER evaluation would be great to incorporate into ANTOS activities. Awesome.
Thanks, Dana.
Thank you, Dana.
Let's have a chat about it offline.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Jo, and we will move swiftly along to our next speakers, which is Daniela Liggett and Steve Chignell, and they will be speaking to us about or towards a biocultural paradigm shift in Antarctic conservation.
Thanks. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can you see this okay?
Yep, sure can.
Okay, thanks. Well, hi everyone, thanks for being here today. Yeah, we're going to be presenting on some work we've been doing with Adrian Howkins as part of the SCAR Anticon program. And we want to start with this map, which is often the kind of the starting point for how we come to think about terrestrial conservation in Antarctica today. This is basically showing the ice-free areas of the continent grouped but into discrete conservation biogeographic regions. And maps like this are useful for decision making because they imply a within region homogeneity with regard to conservation challenges. But we're questioning this and wondering whether this is necessarily true. Are these biogeographic regions similar enough in different aspects to warrant this grouping? And so one thing we can think of is how each of these different regions' histories produce different types of interactions with the environment. And so, for instance, if we do a kind of comparative study looking at the Antarctic Peninsula region. So this has been an important region in the history of Antarctica. So early history of sealing and whaling. It also has an extended history of overlapping claims, so different nations connected to nationalism and imperialism. There are multiple national programs with scientific stations in the region. And it's also a center for Antarctic tourism and industry with some fishing. And so if we compare this in contrast to the Ross Sea region, we see a strong connection also to the history of Antarctic exploration. But it's different in that there's an implicit rather than explicit political difference over sovereignty claims. So you've got the New Zealand making a territorial claim with the US withholding the claim, also the presence of Italy and Korea. Also, it's an important research hub, limited number of national research stations. And the major difference is also is that there's mostly scientific activity rather than tourism. And they both share some fishing. So these different histories shape different approaches and possibilities for conservation. And so, for example, the history of the McMurdo Dry Valley serves to illustrate this point. The ASMA has been developed collaboratively by New Zealand and the United States with support from other interested countries. And this may result in a sort of sweet spot, having two national programs with an interest in Antarctic conservation working in close proximity, benefiting perhaps from both competition and cooperation. So jumping to the present, we want to ask, how well are these different histories and actors represented in Antarctic research today? If we do a quick search for Antarctica on the Web of Science, we see that although recent Antarctic research, so this is the last 20 years or so, has been dominated by the US, there's actually a fairly diverse group of countries represented. However, when we look at the same data by language, we see the outright dominance of English. And this is in part a reflection of the Web of Science data, of course, and the global academic knowledge production system, but it nevertheless shows the linguistic homogenization taking place in Antarctica. If we group the same data by field, we can also see the hegemony of STEM fields. So this is not just an issue of representation or inclusion. It's a homogenization of the many epistemic perspectives of the people interacting with Antarctica. And so this matters, as Teresa et al. Recently noted, who's empowered to shape research questions is unsurprisingly who can shape research answers. I'll hand this over to Daniela.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you everyone for your interest in our talk, which tries to question, as Steve already said, what some of our dominant paradigms and frameworks are with which we approach Antarctic research. And you will have just seen what the present situation of Antarctic publications looks like and who seems to be driving those publications, or in what kind of medium and format they appear. What we then started doing is to question some of the dominant paradigms and frameworks for this kind of research, and also question the dominant paradigms and frameworks behind the policy and management action that we see. And what we can see these days is still this enduring influence of wilderness and intrinsic values in governance and also practice, and also in how we conceptualize Antarctica and Antarctic conservation matters. Those wilderness values are obviously very culturally specific. They're very Western. They're not necessarily shared universally, but they're used anyways. And we did wonder, well, is there something that we need to consider in order to ensure that more voices are included in this discussion about Antarctic futures and Antarctic conservation? Presently, those wilderness values motivate this continental scale mapping of human footprint and impact, and humans are really looked at as the impacting force that potentially does damage to the environment. But we might want to question what actually are the values underlying human interactions in the Antarctic, as well as our research and our management, and whose values are they? Next. Steve, thank you. So we do now ponder how we can potentially move from this universalistic approach to science that largely reduces humans' interactions with the Antarctic to impact, to a more pluralistic way of recognizing different ways of knowledges that also reflect the diversity in views and ways of how we are interacting and studying Antarctica. Next. So when we turn to the future, and here we're really also drawing on what Joe just eloquently presented in terms of counterfactuals, we are trying to understand, well, what will the future hold for the Antarctic and Southern Ocean in the Anthropocene, which, as we know, is the era in which humanity is now recognized as a dominant force of changes to the Earth system. And we really cannot divide the world into those two boxes labeled nature versus future anymore. It's no longer tenable. So when we are thinking about futures, we do have to think about what future scope of human activities and human engagement with the Antarctic. How are they driven? What are the values, the actual, as well as those cherished and protected values that are upheld in management and governance? And how are those driving how we engage with the Antarctic? What are some of the pressures and risks on those broader scale socio-ecological systems in which human activities and environments are very much intertwined? Next. But we also need to ask, well, how do we go about anticipating this future? And it's not just one future, it's a method of futuring usually acknowledges that we have to be imaginative rather than predictive because we cannot know everything. And we explore potential spaces within which the futures unfold as contextual possibility spaces. We could use, for instance, Delphi approaches that involve experts in, say, workshops or follow-up in pre-workshop surveys and try to get a consensus on how those experts view the possible futures as unfolding and how those futures are driven. Next. So when we look at the exploration of possible futures, we do have to consider a political, legal, socioeconomic, technological, and environmental context within which they're likely to unfold. And we have to consider what those drivers of change might be. And those could be, for instance, global power shifts, various climate-related issues and emergencies, just to name a few. And I don't have time to go into those now, but we need to consider a whole host of contexts to explore possible futures. And opposed to those possible futures, or as a small subset of those possible futures, we have potential desired futures next, that essentially try to bring together our ideal vision of what the future ideally should be. And we might want to consider concepts such as One Health, which considers, again, the very intertwined character and the codependence of human and environmental health, which go hand in hand. We also want to consider concepts around justice and equity, want to potentially consider giving systems such as the Antarctic and Southern Ocean personhood and identity, or several identities even. We might want to draw on concepts of guardianship or other indigenous values that
We're at 10 minutes now, Daniela.
That are more heard now. Thank you. I knew we would be getting close to the time. And all of those could frame very alternative approaches to engagement. Next. Try to race through in the last minute. So what we've been trying to ask then was, how do we move from this biogeographical regions approach to an approach that acknowledges this intertwined character of human activities in the past and human engagement with a place and the environmental realities of that place. And here we have to consider, well, first of all, how well do the biogeographic regions capture the biocultural diversity of those socio-ecological systems? And here, acknowledging that, for instance, the South Shetland Islands are one biogeographic region, but there are several islands with very different biocultural histories and issues and characteristics. So we need to take those apart and look at them in greater depth. And we also have to think about, next, please, how regions at different parts of the Antarctic are connected to the rest of the world, be it through climate change and climate emergency, or through ecosystem services in that context, and how this connectivity defines integrated socio-ecological systems that also need to be managed that way. Next, thank you. And in summary, so we have been asking how we have approached Antarctic issues thus far, looking at the past where instrumental values dominated and where Antarctica was viewed as a harsh continent without life or history, shifting into the present where those intrinsic values such as wilderness and wilderness conservation around, and also scientific knowledge in that context, were valued really highly, and where Antarctica was seen as a very vulnerable system which humans impact, and then shifting to the future where we will need to explore how we will approach Antarctic issues in terms of this futuring approach and what potential and possible futures are, considering changing pressures and drivers and different interests in geopolitics, versus how we should approach Antarctic issues in the future from a more normative perspective. Could we potentially value relationships much more, consider the diverse history between humans and nature in the Antarctic, and how Antarctica is actually a biocultural landscape that has been co-produced. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela and Steve. That was super interesting. I'm just going to go straight along to Anik now. So please welcome Anik Wilmot. She'll be speaking to us about the science policy link in practice, how to propose an ASPA.
Thank you very much. Do you see my slide?
We can, yeah.
Hello, everybody from Belgium. Thanks very much to the organizers for allowing us to present this talk. And I represent here a Belgian consortium of scientists. Our basic idea is that scientists go to the field, analyze data and literature, and get a good idea of the environmental values that need additional protection. However, the ASPA proposal process may look quite mysterious and complex, and scientists might feel that this process is something for other people, like environmental managers, sub-delegation members, but it's not their job. Or that this process would take too much time and not be valued for the career. So my talk is directed to those people, and of course not to the specialists that are speaking in this session. But because this will be recorded and on YouTube, I think that it's still valuable. So we think that this participation to the link between science and policy is very interesting, and we would like to give the example of the ASPA designation in the Southern Mountains that was started by Belgium and still in the penultimate step. So I just remind you of the link between the Antarctic science community here at the basis and the Antarctic treaty system for the policy, where decisions are taken about ASPAs. And you see that there are communication channels through SCAR or directly through the individual national delegations. So first, the science base. So our site is in the Droning Woodland in Southern Mountains, as you see here. It's 180 kilometers inland, and in the region where the Belgian station Princess Elizabeth was inaugurated in 2009. Thanks to three projects funded by the Belgian science policy, we could study the biodiversity and come to the conclusion that there is a very rich and unique terrestrial biodiversity on specific sites of the Nunataken ridges, including biofilm and biological soil crust, both mainly microbial and small invertebrates and so on, because this vegetation is at the limit of life conditions. Now look at the policy side. So the ATS website is a wonderful source of documents. And if you look at the Annex 5, which is dealing with an area protection and management, and the Article 3 is explaining what the values are, what is the aim of the ASPA. It's to protect outstanding environmental, scientific, historic, aesthetic, or wilderness values, combination, or scientific research. A bit more detailed, areas kept inviolate from human interference to enable future comparisons, representative of major ecosystems, important on unusual assemblages of species, type, locality, or only known habitat of any species, areas of scientific research, outstanding geological, glaciological, or geomorphological features, aesthetic or wilderness value, and historic value. So where are we with all these values for our site? So the values that we propose to protect are the biodiversity, also the unique representativeness of mountainous ecosystem in very extreme condition in the ACBR 6, where there is only one quite similar biotope, but more impacted by a huge number of birds. There were potential refuges for living organisms during the glaciation cycles in Antarctica, because at least some nenatacs were probably ice-free, and the experimental value as we have installed open-top chambers. There is also the fact that there could be an increase of activities in the area with a potential for negative impacts due to visits and human disturbances, mainly driven by the presence of infrastructures, the station at about 20 kilometers, the blue ice runway for intercontinental flights at 60 kilometers, and a general increase in inland tourism. Therefore, the involved scientists initiated the process of creating an ASPA in collaboration with the relevant ministries, which are Foreign Affairs, Environment, and Science Policy. This general process has several steps, and we will describe them. The first one is a prior assessment, a document to be presented at CDP. We also did the year after an information paper to answer the comments made, but this is not mandatory. And then if the prior assessment is approved, it's possible to make a draft management plan, also to be presented to CDP. And where we are now is this stage where this draft management plan is discussed intersessionally in the subsidiary group on management plan. And this will open a kind of set discussion forum where all parties are invited, and you also. We hope that next year we will have a new version of the management plan based on the CGMP advices that will be able to be submitted to CEP. And if everything goes right, and CEP forwards the management plan, this final version might be adopted by a measure, knowing that measures are legally binding. So this prior assessment, where do you find the document? Of course, in the ATS website, you have a template, which is here. So this Appendix A is a checklist of all the questions to define very precisely what are the values to be protected. It's important because it's the first time that CEP hears about your proposal, and it needs to make an opinion about whether the site deserves to become an ASPA. But they need a communication of all the information because they just don't know the areas that you propose as ASPA. That's why it is important to have an annex with pictures and take this into consideration. So this is how our prior assessment looked like. The reaction of CEP to the presentation of our prior assessment was written in the final report of ATCM in 2017, and globally speaking, it was positive. And we also had questions and very good reactions of other CEP members that we answered the next year with an information paper. Now we are at the stadium. Of course, the next stadium is the draft management plan. Again, go to the website of the ATS to find the templates. And here it is. You see a list of chapters. It's really a good checklist to define everything that you need to put in the management plan, from aims and objective, description of the area, but terms and conditions for permit, entry permits, like how do you move, field camp allowed, how will you dispose of your waste, things like that. And of course, there are many practical questions, and there you really can't answer yourself. You need to discuss with the colleagues, with the operators, all people involved. Pay attention to misunderstanding, as people may think that it's not possible anymore to enter into an ASPA, but in fact, it is still possible when a specific permit is given, but in the conditions set in the management plan. Pay also attention to the fears of others that their research or operation might be negatively impacted. And you need good maps to define the boundaries and other internal characteristics like the presence of structures, the path, etc. So you need to cooperate with a cartographer or somebody working with remote sensing. In conclusion, my message to the scientists who go in the field and are not specialists and don't feel so maybe assured, if you think that your field site would deserve the additional protection of an ASPA designation and you are interested to practice the link between science and policy, discuss with your colleagues and contact your national SCAR or SET representative, contact Antarctic steering committee. And of course, I'm always happy to share our experience. Thanks to all the persons in the ministries which have been very supportive, the Belgian and foreign colleagues involved in research and logistics, and the unsung heroes of Antarctica, those microbial communities. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Annick. That's great. It's so useful to have some of these processes explained that I guess have become second nature for some people, but can feel quite confusing to others. So thank you. Our next speaker will be Anton van der Poot, and he will be speaking to us about data to marine ecosystem assessments of the Southern Ocean, an integrated approach to Antarctic and Southern Ocean management. So thanks, Anton.
Hello, can you see my presentation?
I can only see you currently.
Yes. No,
Oh, yeah.
now it should
Yeah.
work.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can see that.
Yes, thank you. So the paper I'm presenting is actually a paper that was part of the marine ecosystem assessment that Jilda talked about earlier. The group of people that we worked with were more on the data side of things. So for instance, for myself, I run the SCAR Antarctic Biodiversity Portal. We try to aggregate Antarctic biodiversity data and make that available through global data initiatives like OBIS and GBIF. For that, I work with different groups within SCAR, but also with the Southern Ocean Observation System as part of the data management subcommittee. But I'm also, coincidentally, like Annick is one of the scientific representatives to the CEP. I am one of the Belgian representatives to CEMLAR. And so that gives sort of a different perspective on data science and bringing that into policy. And so we wrote this paper together looking at how can we translate data into relevant policy. And it was mentioned before, this term, best available science. And it seems something which is very simple and logic. It's the best science that we can have. But this is just a dump that I did after 2 minutes on the web. There's very different definitions. Is it something which is based on consensus? Is it just what needs to be the right rigorous data analysis process? There's different views on what is the best available science, which can lead to issues. But what we know in the Southern Ocean is that the data is limited. And there's a citation there from Tony Press, from actually that one of the other MISO papers, is that the decision-making in the Southern Ocean can be aided by using the best available science, even if that's imperfect. And that will, in the Southern Ocean, always include a combination of field studies, new technologies, and modeling. And so we wanted to explore a bit more what are the key messages for a system that we want to be working well in the future. Sort of a traditional view on knowledge and going from data to wisdom and to policy is this knowledge pyramid. And the idea there is that you start with data which is collected in the field based on surveys, Then there's scientific analysis based on that data, which leads to information, scientific papers, you could say. And then you have integrative assessments like EPPS, like MISO, that review that literature and come up with a scientific opinion. And that is translated to the level of the policymakers that will then make appropriate decisions. But a system like that, which is very unilateral and going to some higher purpose, is quite flawed, because if you want to do a survey, you need to know what data you need to collect in order to answer the questions that you want to answer at a policy level. So in this graph, you can sort of say data to knowledge, it's the domain of the scientist, and that transition from knowledge to wisdom is the policy level. And what you see is that these two levels need to communicate better. So having this pyramid actually doesn't make a lot of sense. And so the idea that we proposed in our paper is sort of this circular system, where you go from, for instance, if you start there at the top, you have monitoring, you have protocols and use standards that make the data accessible, and that can be used, for instance, for modeling analysis that will inform the knowledge at the policy level, and using products that can inform in an easy way the policy level. And based on that, again, the policy level can say, this is the information that we need. And it's really a system where you need to have communication at the different levels. So all the components need to be connected. But what's also key from a logistical point of view is that you should use existing platforms and standards. You can't keep reinventing the wheel. There is a lot of standards and information out there, so we should build on what's there. And another key component, what we identified, is that this process should be as transparent and traceable as possible. And it's really, understanding these dynamics and change in the Southern Ocean, it needs an end-to-end system of observation, data management, analysis, and policy advice. And one of the key components at a global level are these FAIR principles. They say that metadata should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So you should be able to find metadata. And in this case, as data managers, if we talk about metadata, we mean a general description of a data set. It's sort of an ID card or a credit card application for your data set. Who was involved, which is the general area, what kind of science did you do? So it's not really the data or specific additional environmental data, it's really a general description about a data set, so that people that want to find that data set can understand it. Accessible means that it's somewhere online, ideally the data or the metadata can be found somewhere. And interoperable means that if you collect that from different places, that it can be matched together, that you don't need to spend a lot of time trying to get things to match. And doing that, it is also reusable. You allow people to reuse that data. If you put a lot of restriction on the data that you share or the outputs that you share, it means that others cannot use them. And so these IDs are recently devised for computers talking to each other, but they also apply to humans understanding that data. And what I added there as well is the initial concept is about metadata, but you can also apply that to the data, but also to the code that you use to analyze that data. What we see in the Southern Ocean, this is a map of biodiversity records in the Southern Ocean. And on the graph, you see frequencies in different decades of observations according to month. And what you see is that there's a clear spatial and temporal sampling bias. You can quite literally see the ships leaving from Hobart, going to the Antarctic, the same from New Zealand, and here near the Antarctic Peninsula as well. So you can clearly see that bias. There is a huge bias determined by having access to ice-free areas, which is also seen in the temporal bias that we see. And additionally, there is a bias in the species that we look at. We often look at a number of key species. ChemLAR is very focused on top predators, on krill, on commercially harvested fish. And at the same time, it is an ecosystem management system. So we need to integrate more clearly those other taxa that we need to understand the functioning of that ecosystem. Another concept linked as well is as open as possible, as close as needed. A lot of the data that we see in the Southern Ocean is research data, which is often quite difficult to replicate. It is there's only very few systematic surveys that takes place. So it means that there is a need for more general research that allows to visit specific places more often so that we can see changes over time. Fisheries data in this context is quite particular. Fisheries data is commercial data, and they might not be as keen to share that data. But the idea here is that, building on these FAIR principles, that it should not be an hindrance to share the metadata about the data, to inform people what kind of data is collected by fisheries, and allowing, through a system like CAMLAR, to at least make the information about the data that exists known. But if there's any reasons why that data cannot be shared directly, that you still provide a system like CAMLAR that you have to perform a request for the data. Nevertheless, in theory, it would be better if that data is fully open, because it then means that more people or more stakeholders can analyze and invest that data, and the discussions that you have at a policy level become more democratic between the different stakeholders. I don't need to go too much into detail. Jilda also used this image. It's what happens in Antarctica doesn't stay in the Antarctic. So the key that we have to think about is there is a number of community standards, for instance, for biological data, but also other types of data that exist out there. So if we want to develop our own standards to monitor how the change happens in that system, to make these summaries, we need to look what exists globally. You have EUVs, essential ocean variables, and essential biodiversity variables, for instance, that allow assessing change in ecosystems and that are still under development. SUS has worked on ecosystem assessment ocean variables, which are a bit the same, but have different nuances in how they operate. At that higher level, again, I mentioned before, linking the science and the policy is quite important. You really need a dialogue between the politicians and the scientists. And what we think in this concept is that this open data allows more stakeholders to participate in the discussions. So this is, again, our concept. It's really a circular system where each stakeholder informs and engages with each other. And it's built around a set of essential variables, which are used at a local scale, but also at a more global scale. As a last note towards the future, there is a huge potential now for the Southern Ocean community. We have the UN United Nations Decade of Ocean Sciences for Sustainable Development. Globally, there's a lot of interest in developing these type of metrics and ways how we can translate data into policy. There is a Southern Ocean Action Plan which was published. There should be a talk later this week as well on more details. But what we see is that there's a number of actions within that, like Marine Life 2030, ANIBAS, where there's strong engagement from the Antarctic community, with Clive McMahon, or the Chandler 150 initiatives. And all these initiatives, I think, are key that we as an Antarctic community reach out to and better understand how we can work with them. Last slide is a bit of further reading. So the paper is available on Frontiers as part of the MISO special issues. And I would also encourage you to look at great resources such as SUSMAP that you can find at susmap.aq. Thank you all for your attention. I hope it was an interesting presentation.
Thank you, Anton. That was fascinating. Unfortunately, I do want to ask you questions, but we'll move along to our next speaker because we don't have much time at all. So thank you. And our next speaker is Hanna Yevchun, and her talk is entitled Conservation Values in the Argentine Islands, Kiev Peninsula region in the Antarctic Peninsula.
Hello, I will join in a while. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the connection is fails. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, I think it's just, yeah, we can.
Okay, yeah, perfect. So, sorry. Yeah, here it goes. Hello, everyone from National Antarctic Scientific Center of Ukraine, and my name is Shin. I'm an ecologist in the Antarctic Center, and I want to tell you about the conservation values in the Argentine Islands and Cape Peninsula region. So nowadays there is the modern network of Antarctic specially protected area consists of many areas, actually 75 of them, but there is a widely recognized necessity in some cases for some of the ASPAs for better representativeness and resilience of these areas. And it is really crucially important for future to understand what areas to conserve, to preserve, and it is really important for stakeholders. So one of the aims of the study was to conduct a taxonomic comparison of biodiversity of the ASPAs of the Antarctic Peninsula, and also to assess terrestrial biodiversity of a new area that is actually not being recognized as ASPA now, but up to our data, it is really worth conserving. It is situated in the central part of the Western Antarctic Peninsula.
Sorry to interrupt you, Hannah. We're only seeing your first slide still.
No, I'm not. I'm
yeah?
on the third one. No.
Okay, yep, it's on the third one now.
Oh, but
I'm not sure what was happening.
Maybe something happened with the presentation, but do you see? Okay.
We're on the third slide now, so I think you're good if you keep going.
But do you see the third slide now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Just please let me know if something similar happens again.
Okay.
So we excluded from our comparative study a number of areas because of the big differences from the area studied, including ICBR 2 and 4, and South Shetland Islands as well, marine ASPAs, and ASPA number 148, which was designated for conserving fossil flora, and freshwater and snow algae, fungi, and bacteria because of the lack of reliable data for them. Do you see the fourth slide? Hello?
No, we're still on the third slide.
Oh, sorry, I don't know, something. Maybe the internet fails. It actually fails. Okay.
Anna, I think you're sharing the wrong screen. You're sharing the screen of your PowerPoint editing and not the presentation.
No, it's the presentation, but something happened with my PowerPoint. Okay, but okay, if I
we are on the fourth slide now, so whatever.
But you see the preview. Yeah, unfortunately,
yes.
You see the preview. Okay, let's do like that. And do you see this panel? Oh, yes, you do see. That's sorry for that, but I don't know, something happened with the PowerPoint. So back to the presentation. The rest of the Antarctic protected areas were grouped into two subgroups. All of them belongs to Antarctic Conservation Biogeographical Region 3, Northwest Antarctic Peninsula, but one of them is Northwest, that belongs to Andros Island area, and the second one is Southwest, that belongs to Margaret Bay area. And okay. So we used several databases, including British Antarctic Survey database and this really spectacular illustrated moss flora of Ohira et al., and also Ukrainian and British field expeditions. For speaking about methods, we used for calculating the biodiversity index, we used Whittaker index, which is actually a present substance based on present substance of a species, and it is at the moment one of the it's the only available data for Antarctic, for this area of Antarctica, for most of biota groups. And the issue is that the higher is the Whittaker index, the higher is uniqueness of a site, if in simple words. So we were aware also that this index is really sensitive to big differences in numbers of species, and due to that, we excluded a number of ASPAs when we were assessing some particular groups of species. And back to results, let's start from invertebrates. You can see the results of calculation of this index. The largest absolute value of Whittaker index is circled with red for each Antarctic protected area, but the largest average value of this index is highlighted in yellow, and actually we used these numbers in conclusions. And please pay attention also to an example of excluded ASPA, because it's too low comparative number of species. It's Margaret Bay area ASPA number 129, and you can see that its index 0.81 was really high, which doesn't mean it was unique, because you can see that number of species was 2. So that's the bias due to the very low number of species. And such examples, such cases should be excluded from the comparison. Birds. You can see here that there is no results highlighted in yellow, which actually means that both groups of ASPAs was similar. I mean, ASPAs in all of these groups was similar between each other. And actually it is true, because the bird species composition is really similar. So no really unique sites concerning birds. And for marine mammals, the situation was similar. And I also want to point out that only those species with a confirmed breeding or confirmed as for birds nesting at the site was considered as present at this aspect. So back to mammals. There were no chance to compare sites within Margaret Bay area, because there were only one ASPA with 2 species presented, and 2 species of marine mammals, and same situation, similar for Anvers Island group. And the last result for flora, bryophyta, lichens, and vascular plants. You can see that for Anvers Island group, the winner was Argentine Islands area, that new area that we hopefully will be designated as ASPA in future. And for Margaret Bay area, these we had 2 ASPAs, 107 and 117. Both had high average values of the biodiversity index. And please take a look at the Argentine Islands and ASPA number 177, which is located in the Margaret Bay area. Both of them have high numbers of species, but Argentine Islands has higher average Whittaker index than ASPA number 177. And it means that in this case, when the 2 ASPAs have numerous species, this index can still be used. So, and back to conclusions. Thus, the Whittaker index calculated for these ASPAs, for which comparative reliable data was present, it demonstrates that the most unique sites for each group of biota are respectively for vegetation and invertebrates of Anvers Island group, Argentine Islands, and 113 ASPA. And for Margaret Bay group, you can see also the results, a number of sites. But if we talk about birds and marine mammals, not a single site demonstrated some particular uniqueness. So we can say that biodiversity index in this case can only be applied to vegetation and invertebrates. And that could have been enough if there were no other biota groups, right? Like birds and marine mammals. So we can also assume that additional features of sites should be considered to determine what area can be defined as ASPA. And we tried to do that. Here is the table of features, of possible features for doing that. And each occurrence of respective feature in the particular ASPA is marked as 1. For example, if we talk about Argentine Islands and we see number 3, that means that 3 populations or 3 species are on the edge of their area of distribution in this particular site. So, and you can see that the absolute winner are Argentine Islands, also for Anvers Island Group, but also, as it was mentioned previously, 113 ASPA and 134, and for Margaret Bay Group. These are 115, 117, and 177 ASPA. So what we can say at the end, that if we talk about revised tables, yes, of unique and most valuable sites, revised are marked with, are highlighted with red color. You can see that compared to previous table, I added Argentine Islands to birds here and another ASPA to marine mammals. So we can see that the most unique and valuable for conservation in terms of all groups of biota are 2 sites for Anvers Group and 2 sites for Margaret Bay Group, highlighted in yellow. And in the end, we can say that this methodology, we hope so at least, can be used to assess the biodiversity related values of different ASPAs. And it can also be applied to currently non-designated areas, but that has potential application in the development of proposals for future ASPA, because it's a bit difficult nowadays when there is such big number of ASPA exist. So, and thanks for your attention, and looking forward to your questions and remarks as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was great. It's good to see some connections across the presentations in this session. There is a question for you, which I guess we can very quickly cover. Otherwise, you can type a more extended answer in the chat. But from Dana Bergstrom, thank you for the great talk. Is there enough data to do a WIT analysis on microbes?
I'm afraid that not at this moment, because there are some data for, I'm sorry, do you see me? Because I think my internet fails.
I can see you and your slides still.
My slides, oh, sorry, I stopped sharing screen now.
Not quite yet.
Nope. No, I post sharing.
The IT team can possibly do that on your behalf, but
yeah, I will appreciate that. Yeah, already done.
It's still shared, so if you can try and unshare, that would be great. But otherwise,
I think, okay, I will leave the last slide. Okay, the first one. Sorry, something happened. So speaking about microbes, there are some data, at least for our area, but sorry, judging to your reaction, I'm afraid there's something sharing still.
Yeah, it is still sharing.
Okay.
I'm not sure if anyone else knows how to fix this.
Maybe if you try exiting, like quitting PowerPoint, maybe that would do it. Or
I tried doing that, but I didn't see
oh,
that.
there we go.
That. Yeah,
okay,
because,
great.
it was written that I stopped sharing and it continued. I don't know what happened. Yeah, so there are some data on behalf of bacteria, of microbiota, but just for a number of sites, at least for our site, I know. Some of them they're published, but it's pretty difficult to compare if you only have data for 1 or 2 sites.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, Hannah. We'll just speed along to our next speaker, which is Matt Pinkerton. He will be speaking to us about evaluating the effectiveness of the Ross Sea region marine protected area, overcoming challenges of scale, cost, complexity, and time. So thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Natasha. I'll just try and share the screen. Can you?
Yeah, you can see that.
You can see that. That's great.
Perfect.
So thanks very much. My name is Matt Pinkerton. I'm based in Wellington in New Zealand. And I'm just going to talk about the Antarctic toothfish fishery in the Ross Sea region. So a little bit of background. There's 2 species of toothfish in the Antarctic, Patagonian and Antarctic toothfish. Antarctic toothfish have the higher latitudinal range, so they're kind of clustered closer to the Antarctic. And in the Ross Sea region, That's the section that can be shown here. The toothfish fishery started there in 1997 with one New Zealand vessel. Since then, it's gone up to 14 vessels per year, something like 8 countries fishing in that region. And we'll see here on the bottom corner, this is a sort of trajectory. So as is kind of normal when a fishery is discovered, more and more vessels come in, the catch kind of increases. And around 2004, we put in a catch limit through CAMLR, which holds that catch constant more or less since at about 3,000 tonnes a year. And this graph shows what's been happening to the stock level. So before fishing started, it's at about 100%. We put that at 100%. And then since fishing, we've been in the fish down phase. So the present assessment works out that it's about 63% of B0. Now, according to the CAMLR fishing rules, the trajectory at that constant catch will equalize at about 50% if the stock models are correct. So the Antarctic toothfish is entirely within CAMLR jurisdiction, so it's managed according to that charter, which includes a requirement to maintain stable recruitment of the stock to protect other species in the system and to ensure reversibility from those fishing effects in 20 to 30 years. Antarctic toothfish is a big species, it grows to more than 1 meter long, up to 100 kilograms, and it's caught by longline fishing in the region. You can see here. It must be said it's quite a contentious fishery as well in the Ross Sea. So on one side, the Marine Stewardship Council and other organisations have certified that it's one of the most conservatively and best managed fisheries in the world. On the other side of the scale, there's the Last Ocean campaign, who point out that this is one of the least modified shelf ecosystems in the world, with a full complement of top predators and really important in terms of Adelie and emperor penguins, especially, but as well as a host of other top predators in the system. So a large international campaign to kind of stop fishing in that area, basically saying this is a poor area to be fishing. Sort of into this mix in around 2016 came the designation of the world's, at that stage, the world's largest marine protected area, the Ross Sea region marine protected area. So this is an enormous region. The map on the left kind of shows where that is. It basically has different parts. It's kind of a complicated beast in some ways. It has the general protection zone where no fishing is allowed. It has this special research zone where fishing is allowed, but at a lower level. And it has the krill research zone up here dedicated to gathering more information around krill. And within that, there are 11 specific objectives with sub-objectives. There are, these kind of fall into sort of 3 broad objectives: to conserve representative ecological structure and function, to mitigate threats from fishing, which is really important, and to provide a reference area. One of the interesting things about the MPA is that it wasn't designated open-ended. It was designated with a 35-year lifespan. So if after 35 years, the member states can't show that that has an effect on conservation in the region, then it probably won't continue beyond that. So really the clock's ticking to try and work out how to gather information on this area to see whether and to see what kind of effects of protection over this kind of scale is having. However, that's really challenging for a number of reasons. One is that there's high biological complexity. We all kind of know that. There's lots of species, lots of complex interactions. But the area is also enormous. It's very heterogeneous. It covers deep areas, seamounts, the slope, the continental shelf, right down to the sort of edge of the ice shelf. There's obviously vertical structure within that, things happening in the upper water column on the seabed. So it's a really heterogeneous area. And there's also a high temporal variability. So there's change over time. There's very, very strong seasonal change, obviously with the sea ice. And there's also the life cycles of the organisms vary over their lifespan. Of course, we've got to afford this as well. So if we're going to monitor this in 35 years, for 35 years, how do we do that in a way which is reasonable? So in New Zealand, we've got a program which is called ROSRAM. I'm the PI of that. And basically, that started 5 years ago to try and say, with the advent of the MPA, to say, how can we monitor change in this kind of area? So this is the kind of big diagram about the project. But essentially, on the input side, we're taking a whole range of different kinds of information from Earth system models, from satellite data, drifters, the continuous plankton recorder survey, research voyages every 2 years, shore-based field work to look at predators. We're also taking information from the Camelot fishery itself, or the information that's collected off fishing vessels in the area. And we also have a component which is looking at bringing in the Maori voice in New Zealand to try and give a different perspective on conservation of these Antarctic areas. On the outside, you see that we're kind of interested in everything from the physical environment through the bioregions, primary production, through those kind of really crucial middle species, like the small fish and the krill, up through to toothfish predators and the toothfish prey, toothfish itself, of course, and also bycatch species like the skates, all the way down onto the seabed, looking at the vulnerable marine ecosystems. So I'm just going to highlight a few pieces of work that we've carried out over the last 5 years. We've got 1 year to go. We finished at the end of June 2023. One of the kind of key ways, obviously, is using satellite data. So I did some work for MISO, in particular around satellite remote sensing of primary productivity in the region, and highlighting that only some parts of primary productivity in the Antarctic system are observable by satellite. So only the sort of upper ocean phytoplankton is currently observable. So we worked on methods to try and develop an index of primary production by algae and sea ice. And that's been published. You can get hold of that online. From that, we can look at which areas of the Antarctic have areas where we think the productivity by sea ice algae is increasing. And I think the next step here is also to try and put together this satellite data to do a bioregionalization of environmental change in the Southern Ocean. I think that'll be very useful for informing work towards a network of protected areas in the Southern Ocean particularly. The other big issue is that species move, of course. So toothfish have a life cycle which takes them from inside the MPA to outside the MPA and then back inside. So the small fish tend to occur over the shelf, the Ross Sea shelf. They move up onto the slope area to mature. And then when they're at a large size, ready for breeding, they move out to the seamounts into the north and they spawn there. And then those eggs and larvae are then carried by currents and by swimming back into the coast. So we've done some work where we take a hydrodynamic model, we embed virtual toothfish baby eggs and larvae in there, and then we see where they go if they have different kinds of behavior. So do they swim? Do they stick with sea ice? Do they move up and down in the water column to take advantage of different currents? I'm trying to work out which of those is most advantageous to get these small larvae back into the coast in the areas where they think they occur over a timescale that we think is reasonable. So that paper's been published. And we're now trying to look to see whether we can explain variability in the year class strength of toothfish using variability in the environmental conditions. If we can match that, then the next stage would be to try and bring that forward-looking information into Camelot to try and make the assessments of toothfish more robust to the effects of climate change. So for instance, if the current's going to change or if sea ice is going to change in the future, what effect do we forecast that will have on the recruitment of toothfish? Another way that we're trying to link that environmental information that we can get from the satellites to biological information is through bioregionalization, through biogeography. So we've been involved in the Continuous Plankton Survey project, where you tow this mechanical equipment behind the ships, it collects zooplankton, and then we analyze those in the laboratory. From that, we can relate the abundance of different groups of zooplankton with environmental conditions and produce an extrapolated information on the occurrence of the zooplankton. Because we can do that on time-resolved satellite data, we can also get a time series of that predicted environmental suitability for zooplankton, and from that we can calculate trends. So here are two estimates from that analysis looking at over the last 20 years, what does the environmental suitability change like for copepods and for pteropods? And you can see that for copepods over the last 20 years, we think that the environmental situation has probably got better in the Southern Ocean. It's certainly around East Antarctica. While as for pteropods, it's more or less neutral with a sort of strong decreases in the Ross Sea region.
You're at 10 minutes now, Matt.
Thank you. we've also been looking at sort of comparing food webs between different areas. This is work with Simeon Hill. So do food webs in different places, are they similar or are they different? And putting moorings down to look for sperm whales. So in conclusion, really, linking biological data to environmental information is really important. And I think, autonomous seacraft and autonomous instrumentation is going to really be the only way we can address this challenge of scale in the future. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Matt. That was awesome. It's always great to get an update on Ross Ramp. So thank you. Okay, so our next, no worries, Hyoung, Chul, apparently they're not going to shut us down exactly on the hour. So please welcome Hyoung Chul, our final speaker, with his talk entitled Towards Two-Way Information Flow Between Research and Policy for Area-Based Management in the Antarctic.
Okay. Am I being heard? Can you listen?
Yes, you are.
Okay,
yeah.
all right. Right.
And we can see your screen.
I am Hyoung Shin from Korea Polar Research Institute. And honest confession, I went to Australia a little bit since I wrote the title. Second, I am from a country that has declining but yet undying fishing interest, but has invested far more than fishing revenues. And part of my presentation is upon the interview that I took last year. So I can be viewed speaking in support of fishing industry, but that is not quite true. But anyway, let me go. A little bit of simple background and success factor that I picked up from other published studies, and food for thought from the survey that I just talked about, and performance indicators for MPA and some wrap-up points. Now, well, this is the best purpose, the best, most well laid down objectives of MPA. So these three things are the most common or most reasonable objectives marine protected areas, as I thought. Now, the Aichi target is now gone. We have a new initiative, but in real life, now we have more than 15,000 MPAs, but this covers roughly 7% of the world as of 2017. The map you are seeing is the first network of MPAs in the high seas. This is in the Northeast Atlantic, and it was a OSPAR initiative. This was 2010. When you look back on Camelot, South Orkney MPA was adopted 2009, and Camelot MPA representative network concept paper was given, I gather, 2011. So this is roughly about the same time. Still, there are other waters that can still meet the conservation objective, but yet to be designated. Note that these red areas would have been included, but excluded because they're highly fished, they're fishing interest. And this is something that I took from Nature news article. It just showcased 10 sites that has diversity of the ecosystems. And one of the 10, the number 5, was East Antarctic, which is yet to be adopted. Now, when I tried to what other people said about success and failure of marine protected areas, well, this was the one I liked most. This one said stakeholder engagement is the most important thing. But a word of caution, this is out of 27 sample cases, which is something very coastal, very small, and some fishing taking. So that's 1.5 square kilometer to more than a 300,000 square kilometers, which is in Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So this is not directly comparable to HICE's MPA, like Antarctic MPA, but it still said, it still gives us some guides. Stakeholder engagement is the important, and also when there was no stakeholder engagement was absent, it is most likely to fail. And of course, there are other factors, leadership. There has to be somebody who can make it happen, and enforcement compliance also important. And the questionnaire survey that I indicated when I began, because at the time last year, a government wanted us to look at the national stance toward MPA, and I picked up 45 respondents that has direct exposure or experience with camel affairs. 10 from science, 10 from government policy level, 10 from fishing sector, 10 from professional and technical, like somebody has regional fisheries organization support jobs or secretariat, and then 5 from non-governmental NGO group perspective. I did some multiple choice questions, which has some scale bar, and then I also gave them opportunity to speak freely. And then perception in general was very much as expected. Importance and purpose of MPA understood, accepted by fishers too. But I just took some food for thought type of ideas from fishers' views, which I wanted to share today. Now, fishermen, this is something very easy to expect. Now, the fishermen dislike the portrayal of them as downgrading, downsizing, and degazettement. This is fairly well-known concept in terrestrial protected areas. Anyway, fishermen would, although they would not deny, they would like less limitations, measures, and restrictions, but the size was, to our Antarctic fishers, the biggest concern. In their own words, when there is little breathing space left, that's their most big difficulty. Then, because I gave them questionnaires, but I also spoke with them and interviewed them, so they threw some complaints to me, and benefits of MPA to be shown in very easy way. That's what they would want. It's a sort of performance measure, if I could just use some technical term, like, so how good the MPA was, and for what the MPA was, and could we understand it in comparative terms, like if there was no MPA, things would have gone bad this much, and because we have MPA, things are much better now. So in comparative terms, and in relatively simple and easy numbers, then it would be good for them to persuade their management. And their view was, it's not a big ask, especially when you consider platform opportunity and contribution for fishing vessels to offer. And then it's about complaint toward Korean scientists, perhaps. And science has a role to play between rule setters and harvesters. And their complaint was Korean science is not doing a intervening agency role along the information flow. Okay, so I try to make it very simple. Now, Southern Ocean MPA success perhaps depends on, like anywhere else, but also I was aware that success is a perception dependent and context dependent. And 3 things will be still very important: monitoring and research, of course, with feedback loop, and enforcement and compliance will be very important. But if I could rephrase our fishermen's complaints, then presentability or reviewability or scientific defensibility will be pretty much important. This makes sense when you think of 5-year regular review required and the year 2052 for Rossi region MPA. And then, so for each of the stated objectives, if we can produce a degree to satisfy against those objectives, so somewhat semi-quantitative success measure, it will be very useful to them. Now, I am also thinking that this might aid us in negotiations with countries of historically difficult or unwilling stances. I know this is a very politically high-charged game. I would not name those countries, but when you make a case and when you speak with those entities, this kind of presentability or reviewability will be an asset for more smooth negotiations. Now, this is my final slide. So it's still half-baked thought. More full use of accumulate data in the cumulative data set can be promoted and facilitated. The data is somewhat privileged data set, but if there is a way to improve the use of data, it'll be good. And ecosystem status metrics, both in general biodiversity and also fishery resources or resources species, if we can have some sort of simple number or indicator, that would help. And risk analysis is a very important part of the current MPA-related moves. Well, somehow impact to fisheries can be taken care of on the table, then that will also have too. Now, my final thought, this would not be very popular, but especially in the waters of sizable fishing, especially where proposal is being made and yet to be adopted, interim measures to entice fishers will be very worthwhile to consider. I think I will stop here. I definitely meant to make it less than 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyoung, Chul. That was fantastic. Does anybody out there have any last minute burning questions before we wrap up? I just want to say thank you so much to all of the speakers. It's been a fascinating 2 hours, and yeah, also want to offer to pass over to any of the other conveners if anybody would like to say a few words before we wrap up, but nope. All good. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming along to our session. It's been really great, and yeah, thanks again to the presenters. Awesome work, and everybody's out there clapping for you.
Thank you, Natasha, as well.
Thanks.
Thank you, Natasha. Very good and great facilitating.
Thank you.
Thanks. It was a very nice session. Yeah.
Thank you all and goodbye. See you.